All right, Fedorenko, thank you for being here. I appreciate your time, and I had dove into some of your material and had a deep interest in it. So I wanted to, can you elaborate a little bit on what you do, and just for the audience?
Sure, sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist at MIT, and for the last, I guess, almost 20 years now, I've been working on language and how the human mind constructs linguistic meaning, how language relates to various other human capacities, including some that are considered to be either human specific or at least much more developed in humans than in other animals. So that's kind of the broad topic area, and we use a lot of different methods to ask these kinds of questions to understand how language works. We use functional brain imaging a lot, so functional MRI, but we also use behavioral work. We study different populations with developmental or acquired disorders of communication. We study linguistically unusual individuals like polyglots who speak 20, 30, 40 languages. So we basically study all things language really, and from different angles.
Cool. Yeah, I wanted to understand and let you elaborate on how you got to that point, like where this curiosity was sparked, let's say, and what made you dive into that field. Because I think what's interesting to me is I'm interested, I think, a little bit more from an artistic standpoint, just on, and just generally on how language developed and how we use language. And it's just
Yeah.
fascinating to me, but I was never like, oh, let me dive deep into the neuroscience of this. So if you can give me a little bit of that,
Yeah.
I'm curious what would make you dive into that field so deeply.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so it's I when I was growing up, I was studying multiple languages, and I liked that. That was easy for me. Like it came very easily. But I also really liked noticing various regularities across languages and parallels, and how words are formed, how sentences are structured, and I didn't really know what to do with that in terms of like the field of study or anything like that. I really liked math, so I was doing a lot of math, and when I came to college, which was in the U.S., so I came here in 1998. I tried linguistics, and it satisfied some constraints on what I was looking for, but I thought the approaches were not quite as kind of rigorous and scientific as what I was looking for. But then I discovered that there's actually a field of psychology called cognitive science, which actually focuses on language. So, some people psycholinguistics or cognitive science of language. And it's basically a field that uses state of the art approaches from behavioral experimentation, corpus analyses, uh, computational modeling tools to try to understand how it is that humans develop language in ontogeny, how language, speculate on how language may have evolved, asking things like what makes certain pieces of language harder or easier to process, either in comprehension or production. Kind of what is the stage of computations that happens for me to be doing what I'm doing right now, or for you to be extracting meaning from the sound waves that are hitting your eardrums.
Hmm.
Um, and um, i you know i basically knew that that's what I'm going to do. It just kind of was a very apparent fit. If I hadn't found this, I don't really know exactly if I would have even ended up in science. I'm not sure. But somehow this path paved itself through early interest in language, and then just kind of being attracted to the scientific method.
Mm.
It's
Yeah, it seems
combined.
like an interesting blend between, science and, of course, there's so much variability in communication and how we
That's,
use language and how it's evolved that it does have a mystical element to it because we
that's
can't
right.
fully
Yeah.
understand it, which is
Yeah.
interesting. And so, is there a, I want to know the areas of the brain where like these language networks had formed And then is there an answer as to why we may have evolved that way, or is it still mysterious?
Yeah, I mean, so we now have a decent understanding of the network of areas. People use the term network a lot these days. It just means that areas are connected somehow to each other. So there's a set of areas that are important for language comprehension production. Um, we've learned a lot about those areas, including the fact that they are highly specialized for language. So when I started out, I actually really liked the hypothesis that language may share. Well, we know that language shares certain features with other domains. And so I like the idea that maybe there are some neural substrates that would also be shared. So, for example, one popular idea had been that, language has hierarchical structure, right? We put words into phrases, and then those phrases combine into larger sentences, and we build even longer kind of narratives and conversations out of those pieces. And other domains do that too, to some extent. So music does that, right? So notes combine
Mm,
locally into musical phrases, and then we build larger musical pieces out of those. And similarly, mathematical expressions, right, may have like some local component pieces, and then you can make quite complex expressions. And so one idea that was around is that maybe we have an area in our brain that is really well suited for dealing with these abstract hierarchical representations. Now, I think the idea was misguided in a whole bunch of different ways, including the fact that that ability is clearly not unique to humans. A lot of people were arguing that it was, but even setting that aside, the claim was interesting. And so I sought out to evaluate that claim, and it just doesn't, empirically, just doesn't seem to be right. So we do have regions that process language, including being deeply sensitive to the hierarchical structure of language, but brain areas that process hierarchical structure in mathematical expressions or in music, those are distinct circuits. It's not like we have a shared kind of convergence on any content independent building of structured representation. So that doesn't seem to exist. And in terms of why that system evolved, it's like evolutionary questions are some of the funnest ones to speculate, right? It's like really interesting to kind of ponder
mm,
how these different cultural inventions came about. But unfortunately, it's really, really hard to conclusively, say anything about this. So there's, a few different many different versions of stories of why and how language may have become useful for survival. Can certainly, speculate on existing ones or make up new ones. But one thing that I think changed in the last kind of few decades is an understanding. So for a long time, people were kind of looking for what you might call like a golden ticket, something like one thing that humans kind of figured out
mm,
that made them suddenly such a successful species and allowed them to conquer the world. And a lot of people thought that that was language or some particular aspect of language. Other people had hypotheses that it's actually something to do with social cognition. Yet others thought it's something to do with abstract planning, like planning far into the future or whatever. And I think over the last 2, 3 decades, we've learned a lot about how brains changed over the course of evolution. And it's really apparent that there's a lot of parts of the brain that expanded substantially. Like if you look, compare, for example, a
mm,
chimpanzee brain, and a human brain, it's not like there's one new region emerged, right?
mm,
Or some new type of circuit that didn't exist in chimps now exists in humans. It looks really broadly similar.
mm,
It's just we have a lot more cortex that's not taken up by what you might call kind of low level perception and motor control, right? There's a lot of things we do as biological organisms. We move around, we locomote, we move our limbs, we move our articulators if we're primates, and we move our mouths to eat and do other things. We perceive things, so information comes in through our ears, through our eyes, through our smells. And then there is some chunks of our brain, including in other animals, but in humans, those parts are really extended, which develop slowly, and they're not taken up by these like taking information in from the world and outputting motor behaviors. So you might call these things kind of areas that do thinking. They
mm,
store information about the world, they learn regularities, and then they use those regularities in behavior, right, in
mm,
useful ways. It's the memories, it's the kind of knowledge structures that we acquire by interacting with the world. And so in humans, there's a lot of the brain that's basically that.
mm,
And a lot of work in neuroscience has shown that what people call this association cortex, so it's cortex that's kind of higher level, more flexible tissue that's not linked directly to perception or motor control, and that association cortex contains a whole bunch of different networks, including the language system, but also, for example, a system that supports abstract flexible thinking, and a system that supports reasoning about others' minds, right? Trying to understand why somebody behaved a certain way, and
Mm-hmm.
what their intentions are, and so on. And there's a few other networks. So there's a whole bunch of systems that are distinct from each other,
Mm-hmm.
and distinct from the lower level processes that live in that association cortex. So most likely, in the evolutionary time scale, a lot of these things kind of got more sophisticated over time gradually, as opposed to some like abrupt shift where suddenly we have this new capacity and some new neural circuitry to do that or something like that. So it's likely gradual and not
Like an
like in a
immediate.
golden ticket type way. Yeah.
Understood.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things you you've talked about on a number of different interviews is the fallacy between like being good at language and being good at thought. Is there
Mm-hmm.
a reason you're focused on that? Is that due to a lot of previous people saying, well, if you have good linguistic skills, then you're like a clear thinker? Or can you expound on that
Kind of,
because you do
yeah.
talk about that a lot?
We do, yeah. So that's one of the main things we focused on for quite a number of years, is this question of whether we use language to think. Because again, one of the stories that people have proposed is that the reason that we're able to think these complex thoughts is because we have language. So language kind of allowed us to think certain things we just couldn't think before. And that claim comes from philosophy, which has historically not been linked to data, right?
Mm,
Philosophy is mostly kind of thinking in
mm-hmm,
your head how things might work and trying to kind of logically follow through. But science is inductive. You can't deductively figure out how something works. You need data. You
mm-hmm,
need to see how things actually work. And I was very partial to that idea. It seemed very plausible that language and thought have some degree of um, isomorphism, right? Like that we have to have the language system has to be structured in a way so as to be able to align with thoughts, right?
mm-hmm,
But how exactly it all works together, whether we actually use linguistic representations to think, I didn't know. And so we started this line of work by basically asking people to come to our fMRI experiments, and we find their language regions, and then we ask them to do some thinking tasks, right? We have them do some arithmetic problems, or some kind of a task where you have to hold information, working memory, and inhibit irrelevant distractors, stuff that's kind of linked to what you call fluid intelligence, right? Kind of keeping goals intact and
mm-hmm,
removing all the irrelevant things, or kind of solve social puzzles. Think like how would somebody behave given this and this kind of circumstance, or something like that. And basically, time and again, we found that the areas that work really a lot when you're doing language, either producing or comprehending language, they really don't really work much when you're doing these other things. And instead, it's other parts of the brain that are working when you're solving these different kinds of problems. And of course, from the literature on aphasia, so aphasia is a class of acquired language disorders, there's always been evidence that some people seem to really not lose their intelligence when they lose linguistic ability, right? So you may have a stroke and you can't communicate linguistically anymore. You can't produce things, you can't understand things. There's just really this severe linguistic impediment now. And at least anecdotally, and more recently, in more recent decades, kind of experimentally, there's demonstrations that some such individuals are incredibly preserved in terms of their cognitive ability. So, like if they played chess before their stroke, they can still play chess.
mm-hmm,
If they, compose music, they can still compose beautiful music. They can still solve math problems. And the fact that that's possible already gives you very, very strong hints that the language system cannot be critically required for those capacities.
mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, if you lost language, you should also lose with it the ability to do math and the ability to, do these kind of complex planning actions and so on. But I think somehow with the aphasia literature, people always wondered, well, you do have like these big strokes, but maybe a little bit of the language system is preserved somewhere, and you're using that bit to do these complex thinking tasks. And it doesn't actually make sense, because if you had a little bit of the language system, you would be better at language. So why are
Mm,
you not recovering language, right? But in somehow when we brought in the functional imaging evidence, people started taking that whole literature, I think, more seriously, because it was this really nice convergence of the language system and the brain basically being silent, not showing any activity while people do these complex tasks, and these sometimes severely aphasic individuals showing preservation of these complex thinking abilities. Um, Now, this doesn't undermine the fact that there has to be some ability to kind of cross translate between thoughts and language. After all, like any species that has a communication system, which is all biological species have some way to exchange information, that system will correspond in some way to the kinds of messages the species need to carry, right? Evolutionarily, if you develop a set of communication signals, you do it in the service of whatever information is
mm.
in your minds that you're trying to translate. So of course there has to be some relationship, but apparently it's not words and it's not linguistic structures that we're using when we're solving a math problem or planning a chess move.
Interesting, interesting. And that's the way you phrased it at the end makes sense too, because I think one of the things that language does allow us to do, and I want to know if you feel like there's an overlap here, like if we're talking about communicating something emotionally almost, so something that's bothering us, that's irking us, I feel like in that regard language can be very useful, because if I can clearly articulate something to someone, it's going to allow us to work through some sort of
That's
issue.
right.
But I
Yeah.
do, and maybe even an internal issue, because I noticed that where people would had I had heard like, oh well, writing helps you to think, like there's a positive correlation
That's
there.
right. Yeah.
And I can also see your point where it's like, all right, if I'm playing chess or if I'm playing poker or something of this sort, maybe I don't need my language system in those
Yeah.
moments. But if I am trying to figure out something, like psychologically that's occurring within me, then I might need language
Yeah.
to like unwind it and articulate
That's
it.
right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why therapy works, right? Kind of talking through things sometimes puts things in a certain format where it becomes kind of more easy to inspect somehow than just having these non-verbalizable kind of sensations inside. I mean, we also, so language is, and like, there's no question that language is a hugely useful tool, and it's a form of compression, right? Like, it's a very efficient way to represent information, just like other symbolic systems. So numbers, like symbols, like, symbol for one or symbol for 100, those are not language per se, they're symbols. We do have words for them, but it's also just, symbolic non-linguistic representations. And those are very, very useful to kind of efficiently figure out kind of the core of a problem. To, we also use schematics, right? Oftentimes when we're trying to figure out an argument, maybe
Mm-hmm.
you deal with this when you're writing as well, kind of like, how does this argument flow? You will use, like, maybe you use some words, but you also kind of do these diagrams, right? Like, you have this, and then from these two things this thing follows, or something like that. So we use all sorts of tools to kind of offload information from our working memory and compress it in useful ways, to kind of expand what we can hold on to, right? It's like, it's effectively chunking, if you're familiar with the term, right? Like, why is it easy to remember, you know um, particular sequences of numbers if they have like your birth date embedded in them, right? Because we basically store that as a chunk. We don't need to store the pieces. So similarly, if we have a lot of complex thoughts that we're trying to organize, by packaging them into these efficient kind of linguistic or non-linguistic schematic representations, we can kind of expand what we're currently holding on in our minds. And so, language has been, transformative to our species, because we can also teach each other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Aside from the thing that you mentioned, where we build complex relationships with each other, but also impose structure at the societal level, right? Solve conflicts between nearby tribes or nearby countries or whatever, right? We also, can tell our kids how to build tools effectively, how to build houses so that, you're protected from the elements or whatever. And now, of course, we teach each other, differential equations and all that. And so it's a super useful tool. It's just the discovery is that the format. of the thoughts is fundamentally non-linguistic.
Hmm.
And that doesn't mean that language can't help you in various ways, but underlyingly it's something more abstract. It's not words and it's not the kind of structures we use in language.
Interesting.
Mhm.
And so when you're doing these these imaging these images, is
Mhm.
if someone if someone has damage to the language centers or those areas,
Mhm.
do they end
Mhm.
up more pronounced with let's are they do they end up better in other areas and then vice
Mm.
versa? Is that possible? If someone's really communicative or they have damage to other areas, can they end up more skilled with communication or not
That's a question of like
necessarily?
trade-offs. That's a great question. I mean, so it's interesting. I mean, so in cases of acquired damage, which typically happens in adulthood, right? Like, say you're, whatever, 70 or 80, and you have a stroke and you lose language, you don't generally see anything like that. But there are cases where kind of early damage to particular parts of the brain or congenital, blindness, for example, or congenital deafness can lead to certain what look like advantages relative to individuals who say have access to all their senses or something like that. Um, and there are people who study this. We're looking at this a little bit in cases of kind of anatomically atypical brains, like individuals who grew up with cysts that take up a lot of the brain cavity, a lot of the skull cavity, and so they end up with kind of less tissue overall to work with, and we're trying to see how they cope with that. We don't really do work on like congenital blindness, but there are some cases where it looks like you if there is a bunch of tissue that's not being used for what it was kind of would have been used in a typical brain, then there is some kind of enhanced abilities in other aspects of your life. But I don't know if I would make too strong or too general of claims there, because I think there's also a lot of things we don't understand, and there's also some evidence that actually there's pretty hard constraints on what a brain area can do, because it's ultimately limited by the kinds of inputs it gets and outputs it can send. And
Hmm.
that kind of stuff doesn't really change, right? Those are kind of hardwired anatomical connections between areas. So it's also not like, oh, suddenly you have this extra bit of the brain and you can do whatever with it. That's not quite right either. So it's some constrained version of adaptation to damage
Hmm.
that's happening. And of course, there's always these remarkable kind of anecdotal stories where somebody had extensive damage and like totally recovered. That can also happen. And you know, scientists study these cases very much, try to understand why in some cases and not others people recover so well. But there's still a lot of mysteries in terms of like reorganization and plasticity,
Hmm.
I would say.
You've mentioned strokes a few times. Is that typically what would cause damage to the language centers, or is there other factors, maybe tumors, TBI? Do those cause?
Yeah, all
Uh,
of those things. I mean, so it's basically like any physical damage to the brain in adulthood will lead to those problems. So strokes are kind of a common thing that happens, but yeah, physical damage can do that, right? Like a head injury. Yeah, or sometimes if people have tumors that need to be removed. Uh, yeah, or TBIs is usually uh, a little more diffuse damage. Like most NRTBIs is because the frontal lobe hits the
mm,
front of your skull, and so it's usually more diffuse. It's rarely kind of focal damage, but it can happen. But an interesting thing is that like a lot of the time, if these kinds of events happen in early childhood, it seems like you recover quite well. So that one thing is quite well established. That in many cases, not in all cases, again, we don't understand why not in all cases, but in quite a few cases, even severe damage to the left hemisphere,
hmm,
kind of, in the first few years of life, will basically leave no trace behind, such that the kid will use the right hemisphere homotopic areas to do language, and everything else seems to be kind of, typical. Like, sometimes people say, well, you can find these subtle deficits if you look really carefully, but broadly, some of these individuals end up kind of
And
being
so,
very normal, like
and so the language system is largely left hemisphere.
in most people. Yeah.
Okay. And
Not
then
in all, even in some, maybe you may have an atypically letter. If you haven't been scanned, you would know. But if you're ever in Cambridge, we can scan you and find out. But a small fraction of even typical people with no brain anomalies have a right lateralized language system, and they seem fine.
interesting. I'd be
But
happy to come up and get
yeah,
scanned at some
yeah,
point.
yeah, yeah.
I'm on the East Coast right
So
now, so
there
but
you go.
um but
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, is that just random from your experience? Like some people have a more localized to the right hemisphere.
I mean, what factors determine this? So handedness has some effect,
Okay.
such that in left-handers, there's a slightly higher probability that you will end up with a right lateralized system, but it's not
It's not
deterministic.
exact.
Like most left-handers still have the language system in the left hemisphere, so it's definitely not like a hard constraint. But in general, I think it's super interesting, and it's amazing to me that we actually don't know yet why language ends up in the left hemisphere.
Hmm.
There's a lot of reasons why you might want to have lateralization of functions, because basically the anatomical connections that are within a hemisphere are faster. So if you had a network that has components in two hemispheres, there is some cost to passing information across the left and right hemispheres. So within hemispheres faster, but you could imagine, half of the population ending up with a left lateralized system and half of the population with a right lateralized system, and you would still have all the same advantages. So something is special about the left, so that in most individuals, language tends to go there. And again, there's a bunch of speculations for why that may be, but we don't have an answer to that. Why left? But there's other
Interesting.
functions that lateralize to different. Some functions lateralize to the left, some functions lateralize to the right, and it's probably some complex orchestration of how all these pieces develop during the first few years of life, such that they maybe
Hmm.
push each other. Like social functions, for example, are right lateralized. And, you know, there's some stories that maybe kind of language and social stuff are really strongly connected. And then at some point, it ends up that language becomes kind of left dominant and the social stuff goes in the right. But why this direction again, I don't know.
Interesting. I think it's cool. I think it's cool that you don't attach like a hard answer to things, and I think I don't know is a powerful starting point. It
Yes.
keeps curiosity, keeps.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot of people in academia, maybe not in your field specifically, that you know who are very like hard and
Oh,
like
yeah.
they're stubborn. Like this is the
That's
way it
right.
is.
Yeah.
I'm
Mhm.
left-handed too, so I'm happy to double check that.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Okay, we'll call it over.
um, I'm curious about, you said, I think the term was polyglots and people who speak
Hmm.
like an
Yeah,
insane amount of languages.
that's right. That's right.
How
Yeah.
how does that start? Or is there something
Mhm.
different about these people, or is it just an early life thing?
Yeah, no, it's actually so again, we don't know everything yet, and it kind of we kind of got started on this accidentally. There was just an individual who contacted us, and he was learning 20 or something languages, and said, are you interested
Hmm.
in testing this person's brain? And we're like, sure. And so we like, I'm always very opportunistic in science and kind of try to learn as much as I can from all sorts of sources. And so we initially just tested this one individual. This was back like in, I don't know, 2000, 13, 12 maybe, or something like that. And a striking thing to me was that when they processed their native language, their language regions looked really small. Like the language system just looked very puny. And that was kind of unexpected. Like I would think, if you're really
Hmm.
linguistically uh, proficient or talented in some way, maybe you'll have like a really robust language system with more information stored or something like that. But it was very small, and we, brought this person in again and tested them again, and that was still there. And then we just kind of left it for a while. And then I had a postdoc, Alessia Zhurovdov, who came, who was interested in this question. So she brought in a bunch of other people who learned 5 or more languages, is kind of where we drew the boundaries, 5 plus. And we had people who were extreme, who are like 55 languages at some level of proficiency, which is like an enormous amount of languages. And we've tested a bunch of people, and then a more recent PhD student, now postdoc, Simon Malik Moraleda, picked this up. And so that seems to be a robust finding, that many of these polyglots have smaller language systems
Hmm.
than like individuals who are monolingual or bilingual. And we don't know whether something is special about their language system from the start, so that they kind of become prone to wanting to learn language. It comes easy to them and then they learn more and more, or whether it's just kind of an experiential thing, such that you're basically training up the system like you would, any other kind of muscle or some part of your brain, and you just become more efficient over time at
Hmm.
processing information. So Saima, who is a postdoc now, is actually going to try to ask this question by looking at early multilinguals. So most polyglots, these kind of extreme language learners, they tend to be individuals who actually grow up in monolingual societies.
Hmm.
So they're not like somebody in Switzerland who already is growing up like speaking, 4 or 5 languages, or in India, right? They are somehow, there's a lot of them quite a lot of them in the US. There's some in Russia, there's some in China. So they're like in these very, population with a dominant language. And most of them start learning languages relatively late. But then there are these population of, kids who grow up speaking 4, 5, 6 languages just because the community is very multilingual. And we're trying to see whether in those individuals, the language regions are also small, which would suggest that it's experiential, right?
Hmm.
As opposed to like a linguistic talent or something like that. And a lot of these polyglots actually are very, like they would say, yeah, there's nothing special about me. I just spend a lot of time doing this. And you spend enough time working on something, you get good at it, right?
Hmm.
But some of them do feel like they have like a talent. And there's a gender bias in these answers. You can probably guess in which directions. But anyway, there's a lot to figure out why the language system of these individuals ends up a little different from the typical population. But the empirical observation seems to hold. We've now replicated it in 2 samples of polyglots. And we tried looking a little bit at like professional writers,
Hmm.
because that's also like a very different kind, but extensive experience with language, thinking of how exactly to word things to make the most powerful statement. And we didn't see hints of that. But we haven't done like a serious dive.
Hmm. Maybe it's just different. The I don't know, the
Mm,
nature of being able to learn many languages versus trying to
yeah,
shape language to express something.
express certain
Maybe it,
meanings. Yeah, it could be a different kind of skill. That's right.
yeah,
Um,
it's fascinating though. I mean, it's a wild topic again to even
yeah,
to base your life around too. I'm sure
that's
your
right.
curiosity can continue to grow.
Yeah,
What do you guys focus on in the lab currently? Is it just a lot of different research, or is there a
yeah.
specific?
No, it's always a lot of different kinds of things. I mean, we're actually, so I have somebody who is a postdoc, Haley Olson, who is focusing on early language development. So
Mhm.
trying to understand how the language system comes to be, right? Um, it can't be there from birth functionally, right? Because when you're born, there is no sense in which you could, for example, respond more to meaningful language compared to speech in a language that you're like. It just doesn't make sense, right? We learn, it's a culturally learned thing. And
Mhm.
so at some point, kids begin mapping words to meanings. That happens around 6 months of age. And then by the time they're around one or shortly thereafter, they usually start saying their first words to refer to stuff in the world. And so somehow this linguistic competence emerges between like a half a year mark, and like by 2.5, 3, kids are usually pretty sophisticated communicators using
Mhm.
linguistic information. And so this postdoc is trying to understand kind of how this language system emerges, and also asking this really cool question like, given that you can't possibly have a preferential response to meaningful language compared to some like, say, foreign speech kind of conditions, what other stuff do these regions respond to early in life before they show the specialization for language by the time you're like 4 or 5 years old, right? Do these regions respond to like nonverbal communication? Do they
Mhm.
respond to kind of just meaningful information in the world? Do they respond to a lot to just any kind of speech, like the form of the language? So trying to kind of figure out what are language circuits made of, right? Like
Mhm.
what are the aspects of linguistic communication that are similar enough to language such that the same circuits eventually become supportive of linguistic computations. And we don't have an answer to that yet, but I think it's a really cool and important research program. We're also looking a lot at trying, so remember how we talked about how language and thinking seem to be distinct, but of course in a lot of kind of real world complex situations, we have to use information, combine information from our language system with various thinking capacities, right? So I can tell you some new information about some shared acquaintance, right? And you have to kind of integrate it with your social knowledge of that person. Or I can teach you something about, some country or whatever, give you some new piece of knowledge, where I can explain to you how, so something works or something like that. And so these different kinds of things require this kind of fast and continuous interaction between the language system, which is just processing the information as it's coming in, and these more kind of higher level systems that store knowledge and reason about the world or about abstract relationships between things. And so we're trying to use these more complex paradigms where, for example, you get like a verbal math problem, like the kind that you've solved a lot in middle and high school, right? Like train A leaves train, platform A at such and such time, travels at such and such speed, where, this information eventually needs to make it to a system which actually solves math,
Hmm.
but the information is coming in through a linguistic format. And so we're trying to understand how the information changes when it goes from the language system to this more abstract arithmetic solving thing. And there's many of these kinds of interactions, like I said, language and social reasoning, or language and mathematical reasoning, or language and kind of abstract logic. Uh, and of course, with these days, we now have this, we often call it a new model organism, these large language models like
Hmm.
ChatGPT and all of its friends. And, these models are really very powerful in their behavior, right? Like it's the first thing other than the human brain that can do language.
Hmm.
That's a big deal. Like it just didn't exist before. Like, I was told, and many other people in my generation were told, there's just nothing in the universe that can produce or understand human language. It's only the human brain that can do it. Well, that's obviously not true, because we now have these systems that are really, really proficient in language. And we found that it turns out that their internal representation, so just like you can look inside the brain, right, at the patterns of activity, if you look inside these models at the patterns of unit activations, the way that these models process linguistic information seems to be somewhat similar to how humans do it. So it's not just the behavior is like fluent language, but there's something internally that ends up looking quite similar to how the human language
Hmm.
system does language. And so this similarity now opens doors to a lot of cool questions, like trying to understand, what drives this similarity? Why are some models more similar than others? Can we make more kind of biologically or developmentally plausible versions of those models? Because of course, like off the shelf, like ChatGPT is a very different kind of thing than like how a human learns a language. And so that's like a big other direction.
Hmm. What do you, and I'm curious, and this I might be too broad of a question, but like
Mm.
how is that going to evolve our understanding of language or consciousness itself, or where do you have an idea of where this is going to take
Don't know
us?
about consciousness, but certainly I think, I'm hoping that it will tell us something about how language works. I mean, we can think of it like as for many years, people have used animal models in
Hmm.
neuroscience, right? Like we study mouse brains, not because we're particularly interested in mice, but because the biology is similar enough so that we think if we develop a drug for Alzheimer's, maybe it will also work in humans, right? And for things like language or numerical reasoning or, kind of abstract logical thinking, mice are not a very good model, right? I mean, they can do, even macaques, right? I mean, they can do a little bit here and there, but it's quite different from kind of how, humans think. And so now we have these in silico models that behaviorally do these complex things.
Hmm.
And a parallel, like, why do people use mouse models? Well, because you can do things with mice that you can't do with humans, right? You can do circuit manipulations that we just ethically cannot do in human brains. And so similarly, we have these models, and we can do things with them that we can't do with humans. So we can take them apart in whatever way we want. And it's a first system that's a fully computationally instantiated thing that does our behavior of interest, which is language in this case. And now these models do more, but let's just stick with language for a second, right? And we can try to understand, you know, how are these representations structured? What are the exact algorithms that happen that allow this model to accurately predict, the next word, or to make a judgment about whether a sentence is grammatical or not? And in humans, part of the problem, especially in studying like early language development, but even later, like a lot of things are entangled in our experience, right? Like we, as a kid, we're born and we're learning a language during the first couple of years of life, but we're also learning a ton about the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have information come in through all our senses, we interact with the world. These models are these very nice, pure systems where you can just give them linguistic input and you control exactly how and what kind of input you give them and try to see how those representations change without the influence of all the other stuff. So they're like a very nice experimental tool to try to isolate various factors that might affect, the emergence of language, or how language eventually connects to other capacities, because you can also build models that have a language kind of component, but also more maybe embodied thing that processes visual information or something like that. And so it's a really, really powerful tool. The thing that like nihilists will often say is like, well, they're so different from human brains, we'll never learn anything. And it's certainly possible that it's just a very different form of intelligence and it's
Mm-hmm.
nothing like us. But there's also all sorts of tools that are already in existence and keep emerging every day for adjust for making these models a little different, making them more biologically plausible, right? So now that we see that this level of complex cognition is possible within these systems, we can try to build them with more complex neurons. We can
Mm-hmm.
try to add wiring length constraints, right? In human brains, you often want to minimize the connections that between areas that have to talk to each other a lot, because it's costly to transmit information. These models don't have any such constraints. They don't have memory limitations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Successful language models will keep track of like 1,000 tokens back of context. Humans don't keep track of 1,000 words back, right? You get meaning and you discard because we're memory limited,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we don't need to remember exactly the words that you said. You want to just get the information out. Anyway, so there's a lot of efforts to try to turn these models, make them more biologically and developmentally plausible, and see if those models maybe even better capture some aspects of human behavior or internal representations. I think there's a lot to do with this. It's a very exciting new tool that we just didn't have, and I didn't think we would have in my lifetime, but we do. So that's great.
I think it's a good perspective too, because well, also just based on the nature of your field, but there are a lot of people who feel not just nihilistic about like we're not going to learn anything from this, but also
Yeah.
afraid of
Yeah.
how advanced things are getting. But
Yeah.
I think we can't resist.
Yeah.
We can't fight it. So
I think it's very hard to predict how this whole thing will unfold, and we should definitely be worrying. Like, we should definitely, think about the potential implications. But I think it's just really hard to predict things. But
and there's a lot of positive possibilities as well.
yes,
Uh,
exactly, exactly. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's certainly true.
and a few more questions. So,
Hmm.
how has your with the with the nature of what you're studying and just being in your field, how has your view of the world or your consciousness or even just the way that you perceive language, how has that evolved over the years, or has it? Has it grown? Has it felt?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly the dissociation between language and reasoning has been really quite illuminating and kind of made me, you know, rethink some of the kind of heuristics that we typically rely on as humans. Because like, why do people think language and thinking are so connected? It's like, well, in practice, in our experience with people, those things often go together, right? Somebody who speaks really well typically has good thinking that generates these interesting ideas, or like really fluent, right? So we kind of have that correlation that we observe, and it's a very new experience phenomenologically. It's just a very new thing that we have, where we have that system, and there is no brain that generates any kind of thinking. It just produces this fluent text. right?
Mm.
And it feels like there's more to it. It feels like maybe it has feelings and maybe it's conscious and understands things that it really can't, because it's just doing this very kind of, relatively low level task of, linking things together linguistically. And so, but then once you start thinking about it, of course, you also realize that, well, actually, uh, it is a fallacy. Like, it's a correlation that happens a lot of the time, but like individuals with aphasia are out of that distribution, right? There, in many of them, intelligence is totally intact, and we just can't, they can't communicate linguistically. Similarly, sometimes you have certain individuals who are very fluent linguistically, but are kind of like BSers, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you like actually pay attention to what they're saying, you're like, what? That doesn't really make sense, right? But they produce this very fluent kind of speech, but it doesn't, like, kind of lacks the, thought complexity. And similarly, there are people who are disfluent, either because they're not a native speaker of a language, or because they stutter, or because they have, some speech impediment or whatever, or just in general, like, just not fluent speakers, right? Some professors like are like that, right? And they can't explain things really well, but you see that they're so smart, and they like
Mm-hmm.
see things in some format that is just not accessible to most other mortals or whatever. And so, you kind of start noticing these associations more clearly once you realize that, like, they really are quite separate. And we're now, like, one other thing we're actually actively working on is trying to also understand what kinds of thinking are distinct from each other, because it's not just like all one thought bucket. Like I already mentioned, that social reasoning is quite separate from kind of abstract formal reasoning and mathematical reasoning. And there are some other kind of forms of thought that seem to be, people are finding that they rely on specialized circuits, like intuitive reasoning about the physics of the world, or maybe particular forms of deductive reasoning or something like that. So that's still also an active area of research to understand kind of how the space of thought is structured. So I have a graduate student, Hope Keen, who is working on this. And some people are actually trying to ask that in models, in these large language models. Like, do you see any kind of separation between the parts of the models that do different kinds of reasoning, to the extent that you think some of these latest ones actually engage in stuff beyond language? But,
Yeah, it's fascinating shit. I appreciate you.
yeah,
Um,
thank
and
you.
then my, I also you could tell that you really do have a care for this field and a passion for this field, which is awesome.
Yeah,
Because what the fuck else are we doing? I mean,
exactly.
we should.
No, it's,
A lot of
yeah,
people don't, they don't have that deep interest
yeah.
in the things that they're articulating and exploring. So I always appreciate that,
Yeah,
and it makes
no, in
life.
academia, I think, like, if you go into an academic kind of area, you need to have passion for this, because, like, otherwise it's, it's not, you're not going to make a ton load of money. Like, it's not, a field that you go to, like, become rich or whatever. And so, like, and you get, if you're not getting joy out of discovering how things work, then probably not the right choice.
Hmm. And my final question would be just a curious question about who you're inspired by, if it's someone in academia or if it's and also maybe even artists or writers or people that you've like really leaned on in your life.
Well, I mean, I did have really good mentors. So Ted Gibson is a former mentor. I came to work with him on language, and then I ended up marrying him because I liked learning from him. And then I ended up shifting more to neuroscience. So Nancy Canvisher was who I learned how to do kind of rigorous neuroscience work, and she's been great. But my mom was very special. Like, she was very unusual in the kind of environment in which she existed, to kind of push on the things that she pushed, and having this vision for how you can really break all sorts of boundaries. Even, like, I grew up in pretty extreme poverty and, like, with a lot of adversity, and somehow she invested in all the right things in all the right ways to kind of make me see that there's just really no boundaries. I mean, the boundaries are what you set for yourself, kind of. And even in, like, extreme situations, you can get out and do things that are really meaningful, and you can become the best in the world at something, and that's like really special to hear as a kid. Like, she would tell me like, what do you want to be the best in the world in? Like, what
Hmm.
kind of expert are you going to be? And this idea that you can, you can start to imagine this big world, right? There's like billions of people, and it's very empowering that you have somebody who thinks, really believes that you can be an expert in something, and you can be like the world leading expert in
Hmm.
X. And so I didn't know what it would be yet at that time. I mean, I liked math, but I was good at math, but I probably knew that I didn't quite have it in me to become like a professional mathematician. Like in Russia, there's a lot of very good, math people. So I won a few Olympiads here and there, but it wasn't like,
Hmm.
so I didn't know exactly like what direction I would eventually go in. But once I found languages, I kind of knew that that was for me.
Cool. Well,
Yeah,
we were, I was going to wrap it up. Did really
yeah,
enjoy talking to you. I think again having the passion and what you were saying about
yeah,
your mom being able to
yeah,
inspire you to push those boundaries and to be the best in the world. That's something
yeah,
I think that there's not a lot of people receive that message, and especially not a lot of kids. And it's
yeah,
also beneficial to break through the adversity, because I've also seen people grow up with everything,
yeah.
and we all want to provide that for our families, but
That's
it
right.
it can hinder you, and even comforts can hinder us, which is interesting. So
Yeah, yeah,
cool.
exactly. No, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
So thanks very much for talking to me. That was fun. You asked good questions.